Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power. My name is Faraz Patel. I will be in your company for the next 55 minutes. Well, in the second part of the show, I will be having Mark Haywood. He is the editor of the Daily Maverick to give us an overview of the study of cartel dynamics and, of course, what is currently happening in Zimbabwe. But first up, well, this was the breaking news that happened on Monday. Former President Jacob Zuma once again not appearing at the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Well, there's a whole lot of constitutional aspects with regards to this, and the question is, will the former president face prison time for not going ahead and attending the State Capture Commission of Inquiry? Well, to unpack this, I have the honor of having Professor PIERRE. He is a constitutional law expert at the University of Cape Town. Good evening, Professor, and thank you so much for joining us here on ITV Networks.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Now, it's an absolute pleasure. Professor, let's just talk about the defiance of the former president, and with regards to how bad is the situation with him disregarding the Constitutional Court ruling.
So the fact of the matter is that if the court makes an order, then the party who's bound by that order must obey the order, unless, of course, you appeal it to another court. There is no choice for you. So the president's arguments that he had a right not to obey the order is false from a legal perspective. The problem is that the whole legal system depends on people respecting the courts and the order of the courts. So if people start disobeying the courts, then you have chaos. Then any order, whether it's an order for somebody to pay back money they owe you, protecting poor people from exploitation, whatever, those things will come undone. And so the whole system will collapse. And when that happens, the people with more power will have their will enforced in an arbitrary way. So if you have money, if you have political power, if you have a lot of guns, you are going to hold sway. So this is obviously not desirable. For this reason, it is really a very irresponsible thing that the former president did, and hopefully it's not going to be followed by anybody else, but it is not the kind of thing that a responsible person respecting the constitutional democracy will do.
And Professor, I mean, that comes to my next question. The fact that this isn't the first time that he has refused to cooperate with the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Surely this sets a bad precedent, doesn't it?
Well, yes. So the Constitutional Court actually lambasted the Commission of Inquiry, saying that it was treating President Zuma far too leniently, far more so than anybody else, exactly because of President Zuma's reluctance. And so the fact that he has now actually defied the Constitutional Court sets a very bad precedent, as you say. Luckily, he's no longer the head of state, because that would really have created a constitutional crisis, because it would have set up the executive directly against the courts. He's now just a private citizen, so while it is really lamentable, it is at least not an immediate constitutional crisis that we are facing.
And Professor, you speak about him not being a head of state, but of course when he was a head of state back in 2016, the Constitutional Court ruling for him to go ahead and of course pay back the money for the Nkandla homestead upgrades. This seems to be a person who once again just doesn't seem to respect any sort of law within the country. And then again, for a public servant, this isn't good, especially for citizens who look at this and say, well, if the president can do it, surely we can do it also.
Yes, so obviously that is the problem. So if people are going to follow the example, it will obviously be setting a bad example, as you say. The interesting thing is that the former president has not always been so reluctant to trust the courts. When he was fighting not to be prosecuted and to have his prosecution stopped, he used the courts for many, many years to try and do that. Now that the courts are not helping him, he is attacking the courts and is disobeying the courts. So the important thing here, I think, is that the people in the executive, the government of the day, they have to make it very clear that they are not supporting this defiance of the law and of the constitutional system, because if they are not going to show that they support the courts and that they are not supporting former President Zuma, then of course it will be much worse, because then far more people are going to start thinking that it is acceptable not to obey court orders and to act as if you are above the law.
Professor, his legal team, now a lot of people would say they have a stroke of genius for making sure that former President Zuma avoids any sort of prison time. Well, legally, when you look at it, the advice from his legal team, can you maybe give us an idea of the pros and cons with regards to the advice that they are giving him right now?
Well, I think one must distinguish between advice that is purely based on the law and what is best legally, and political advice. So legally, the president, whether he is advised or whether he decided himself, has no leg to stand on. He's probably going to go to the Constitutional Court, and unless he can show that he actually didn't deliberately defy the court, which will be difficult because he actually has now stated that he did so deliberately, he's going to be found in contempt of court. He might even be incarcerated for a few months, or it might be suspended on the condition that he testifies. So legally he has lost. His legal strategy is a complete nonsense. But I don't think that is what is happening here. The strategy is not to win a legal battle. It is political, to try and create a perception that the former president is a victim of some kind of conspiracy, and to ultimately to delegitimize the commission, because obviously the commission has heard a lot of evidence implicating the former president in wrongdoing, state capture, and perhaps corruption as well.
Professor, you talk about obviously the delegitimization of obviously the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, and of course the former president's argument is that he wants a recusal from Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. So can he win in terms of that? Can he get the current DCJ to go ahead and remove himself from the commission? Remember, this is a commission that was set up by former President Zuma. So does he have a case for the Deputy Chief Justice to recuse himself from this commission if former President Jacob Zuma wants to attend the State Capture Inquiry, but with a different Deputy Chief Justice?
Okay, so he made the application before the Deputy Chief Justice, as is required by the law. The Deputy Chief Justice rejected the recusal application, and so now it's going to be taken to the High Court for a review. The chances of success is very limited. I would be very shocked if the court overturns the decision by Judge Zondo, because in our law, you cannot just say that a person must recuse him or herself as a presiding officer because of some kind of connection between the two parties. You have to show that a reasonable person will be worried and fearful that there will not be objectivity. That's the evidence presented by former President Zuma in this regard is not really persuasive in this way. But secondly, of course, whether that happens or not is completely irrelevant to whether the court order has to be obeyed. Even if he had a good chance of success, that is irrelevant for the fact that the Constitutional Court has given the order and that he has a legal obligation to obey.
I'll continue my conversation with Professor PIERRE after the break. Just to wrap up, of course, what had happened on Monday with former President Zuma not attending the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Truth to Power. I'm continuing my conversation with Professor PIERRE, a constitutional law expert at the University of Cape Town. Professor, legally, how hard can our justice system enforce itself on former President Zuma if found guilty on this account?
Yeah. Okay, so this is an interesting issue, because if you understand that our courts depends on the other branches of government, the executive branch of government, to enforce its court orders. it really trades in credibility, legitimacy, respect for the court. But the actual enforcement is done by the police, the other branch of government. So that means that as long as the police and whoever is going to do their job properly, there will be an enforcement of the order. Now, what such an order might be, we don't know. There might be a guilty finding and a position of a fine. There might be imprisonment that is suspended on the condition that the former president testifies, or there might be imprisonment in any other way. Whatever the order is, the important question is, or important issue is that those who are required to enforce it, in this case it would be the police, if there's going to be arrest, that they actually do so in compliance with the law.
Professor, obviously I raised an important question earlier on with regards to the president's and what this has on effect of public servants. And of course, former President Jacob Zuma, he being a president on 2 terms, still is seen as some sort of a public servant, and of course a former head of state. Him not obeying these rules, him not, conforming to what the Constitutional Court ruling was. A constitutional crisis, is it a stretch too far to say that we're currently in a constitutional crisis, or are we far away from it at this moment?
Yes, so I think that it is maybe not accurate to say that there's a crisis right now. Of course, if Jacob Zuma was still the president, it would have been a huge crisis, because then you would have had the head of the executive in direct conflict with the highest court in the country. And in those fights, we know that it is going to be the executive that wins. Luckily, in some way, the former president is a former president. He has political influence, but he doesn't have state power. So as long as the executive is going to respect the courts and uphold the law, we should get through this crisis, and it will show that the system is resilient and that it works. But there is that caveat that it is very important that the executive branch of government is not going to act in any way to send a signal that they agree with President Zuma, or that they are appeasing him or acquiescing with his decision to defy the law.
Professor, I want to turn the attention to an article that you wrote in the Daily Maverick, and I quote, you mentioned that while Zuma all but admitted that he was acting in contempt of court, this does not mean the former president is automatically held to be guilty of contempt. The Commission will have to make an application to the Constitutional Court, asking it to hold Zuma in contempt of court and to impose a suitable punishment, which could include imprisonment. So, Professor, can you just give us a process of how this could happen, and in your view, the time frame for this to be executed?
Yes, so what happens in contempt of court cases is, because the person potentially could be sent to prison, the Constitution requires that there has to be procedural safeguards. So you cannot just assume somebody is guilty and send them to prison. So that's why the State Capture Commission is going to go to the Constitutional Court and make an application in which they're going to bring the evidence, because they have to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the former president was ordered to do something, that he refused to do it, and then the court has to decide whether he did so intentionally. If that is proven, then there's contempt of court. But before we get there, there's going to be a tricky legal question, and that is whether the Constitutional Court is actually the court who should hear the matter, because there are some lawyers who argue that this should really be done by the High Court. The Commission says it should be done by the Constitutional Court, because they are the institution that actually issued the directive. So there's going to be some procedural wranglings, but assuming they take on the case, they hear it, it will depend on whether they do so on an urgent basis or not. If it's done on the application is done on an urgent basis, it will be a month or 2 months, and it will be resolved. If not, it will take 6 months or a year for the matter to be resolved.
Professor, being obviously a constitutional law expert for so many years, and seeing obviously since the dawn of democracy the cases that have, of course, been occurring in the Constitutional Court, what do you think, if you can put your prediction hat on what will happen with regards to what we have seen this week, and how does this play out in the next few weeks?
This is a very difficult question because we are actually in a completely unprecedented situation. There is no prior situation like this. Yes, in the 1990s, there was the case of the apartheid president, former President P.W. Botha, who defied the TRC, very much like former President Zuma did. In that case, he was given a suspended sentence. Whether the same situation arises here, I don't know. I think one of the options which I prefer, but I don't know if the court is going to go that route, is to impose a prison sentence, but to suspend it and say this imprisonment will only kick in if the former president continues to refuse to obey the constitutional court order. Whether they will do that, I really don't know, because it is so unprecedented. This is like something completely new for all of us.
Professor Pierre de Vos, constitutional law expert at the University of Cape Town, we thank you so much for making the time for us and giving us a perspective, of course, what happened with this week's proceedings.
Thank you very much.
No, it was an absolute pleasure. Well, there we go. It's going to be very interesting to see with regards to what happens. And of course, if you are a betting man and you'd like to know what's going to happen with regards to whether former President Jacob Zuma will receive a prison sentence or whether he will continue to defy every sort of law that has been imposed. It's going to be an interesting few weeks with regards to that. And of course, you add on the factionalism that is happening in the ANC. We saw the MKMVA going ahead and camping itself outside of former President Zuma's Nkandla homestead. So this is a very tricky time, a test of our constitution, a test of our politicians, and of course what happens next will have a direct implication with regards to the politics of the country, and of course what happens to us as citizens. As us as citizens, all we want is a functional democracy and a functional country that we can all be proud of. But if we do have these crises that are going ahead, it is going to make things very, very difficult on us. Well, the next segment of Truth to Power, I will have with me Mr. Mark Heywood. He's the editor of the Daily Maverick. And of course, it is a report that was published, a study of cartel dynamics, and of course, what is currently happening in Zimbabwe. We all know that Zimbabwe continues to bleed financially. COVID-19 has not helped the situation. And of course, this is a country that has such a high rate of unemployment. And of course, we've seen many of our citizens from our neighbors, Zimbabwe, going ahead and trying to find a life for themselves outside the border of the country. So of course, we'll have Mark Heywood with us to give us an idea of just how bad the situation is in our neighbors in the north of the SADC region. So stay tuned to Truth to Power, and I will of course have a conversation with Mr. Mark Heywood. Welcome back to Truth to Power. My name is Firas Patel. I'll be coming to you on DSTV channel 347. Of course, in the first part of the show, I spoke to Professor Pierre de Vos to give us a constitutional view of what happened this week with former President Jacob Zuma not attending the State Capture Commission of Inquiry. Now, last week, the Maverick Citizen published an exclusive report which provided a post-mortem of the cancer that killed the Zimbabwean dream of freedom and independence. This report is called the Study of Cartel Dynamics, and it is a 64-page report which details the scale of theft, among others, illicit cross-border financial transactions, which has cost Zimbabwe up to a staggering and a massive $3 billion a year, and billions in gold and diamonds which have been smuggled out of the country. Well, I have the pleasure of having Mr. Mark Heywood. He is the editor of the Daily Maverick, just to give us an idea of how bad the situation is in Zimbabwe. Good afternoon, Mr. Heywood, and thank you so much for joining us here on Truth to Power.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me.
No, it is an absolute pleasure. Mr. Heywood, $3 billion for a country that is suffering in terms of unemployment a country that is at the beyond its knees right now and trying to keep it going. Just how bad is it right now in Zimbabwe, and especially with regards to the report that was published in the Maverick Citizen?
Yeah, good afternoon. Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that $3 billion is probably a conservative estimate. The authors of the report believe that it is upwards of $5 billion per annum that is lost to corruption, to collusion, to illicit financial transfers. And for a country that has a gross domestic product of $21 billion per annum, that's 25%. More than 25% of its GDP. So you can imagine the scale. And you have to contrast that figure with what we know about the social and economic conditions that face the ordinary Zimbabwean. Millions of people literally in extreme hunger. 90% of the workforce in the informal economy rather than the formal economy. A health crisis that pre-existed the COVID-19 crisis. So there's a direct connection between a country that is actually rich in natural resources, rich agriculturally, rich in diamonds, rich in gold, but incredibly poor when it comes to the population. And you have to ask the reason, well, why is that? And the reason is simply that there is a terrible level of misgovernment, but it's not just bad government. What this report shows is that it is actually a collusion between senior people in government and senior people in business to rob that country blind. So let me say that, we decided to publish this report. We are not the authors of the report. The report was authored by people in Zimbabwe and researched in Zimbabwe, but they felt at this moment that it's too dangerous to publish it in their own names in that country. So we decided that it was in the public interest, not just the Zimbabwean public interest, but the South African public interest, that this report should see the light of day and should become the subject of discussion in both of our countries.
Mr. Haywood, and you speak about the dangers of publishing this article in Zimbabwe. Of course, we tried to get Hopewell Chinono, who is a journalist in Zimbabwe, and of course, activist Fadzai Mahere. Of course, both of them, I did have conversations with him earlier today, and because of other activities, they will not be able to attend this conversation. But of course, this is a subject that isn't going away soon, so we intend on having them later on in the year. Mr. Haywood, just give an idea to the viewers of how bad it is in terms of suppression of media and suppression of civil society activists not to have this article published in Zimbabwe, which means South Africa, being a democratic country, it can only be done here.
Well, you mentioned Hopewell Chinono, you mentioned Fadzai Mahere. Both of them have recently spent time in prison. Fadzai Mahere is an advocate, a lawyer, and a member of parliament, but she was still arrested on trumped-up charges. Hopewell Chinono has 3 times been in and out of prison in the last 6 months for lengthy periods, once for retweeting a tweet. But the real reasons that Hopewell appears to be being hounded is because he exposed corruption around COVID-19 involving the then Minister of Health in Zimbabwe. But, it may sound strange to say this, but Hopewell and Fadzai are the lucky ones. There are people that I work with in Zimbabwe, people who provide information to the Maverick Citizen, where there have been instances where activists are abducted, they disappear for a number of days, they're tortured, and then they are found dumped somewhere, close to death, often. So, it's a situation where, although you have a media, and it's very brave, the media that exists in Zimbabwe, and it's very vibrant, and people do their best to tell truth and to report what is going on in that country. But there is also a legitimate fear that if you poke the dragon, you will pay a price for it. And I think the fear of the people who put this report together is that it is a very unusual report, because it's not just a one-off thing making allegations of corruption against this individual or that individual. It's a report that joins the dots. It's very similar to reports that were produced in this country a few years ago, for example, by the South African Council of Churches at one point, the organization called PIERRE. It provides, as I describe in the article that I wrote, an anatomy of the capture. It cuts it so that you can look and see what is its modus operandi? Who are the people involved? The report names the president, it names the vice president, it names a range of current and present politicians. And it doesn't just say President Mnangagwa is involved, it says he's involved in this way with this particular cartel protecting these groups of people, and so on. So, it's very strong, and I think that is why the report has created ripples in Zimbabwe. It's been it's been welcomed by many, many people, overwhelmingly welcomed, but it's also led the government to feel very uncomfortable, and people associated with the government.
Mr. Haywood, you speak about President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Now, he's been a public critic. He said this on a number of occasions against, trying to clamp down illicit financial transfers. As you mentioned, he's been identified in a report, not just his name is there, he's been identified as one of the cartel bosses. If you have a sitting head of state being identified as a cartel boss, this spells trouble, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It's what we in South Africa would call state capture. I've been talking to some human rights activists in Zimbabwe, and they say, look, the tragedy is that actually it is government that is captured by these cartel bosses rather than the other way around, that government has captured the cartels. And what the report tries to show is that this is not a new phenomenon. It didn't even begin with Robert Mugabe, by the way. That some of this started even before independence in 1980, but that some of these individuals have repositioned themselves in relation to each government, and now in relation to the government of President Mnangagwa, and are continuing to rob the country. And what the report shows is, it provides an analysis. There are case studies of tobacco, case studies of agriculture, case study of the Zimbabwe National Roads Authority, case studies of gold, and it shows you how it's happening. And we would be very familiar with it in South Africa, because it's the type of thing that's being reported every day in the Zondo Commission at the moment. Except that in Zimbabwe, it's taking place without any kind of legal restraint, as it was taking place without legal restraint in South Africa for quite a number of years. But fortunately, that has changed here.
Mr. Haywood, before we go to the break, I mean, you mentioned, quite importantly, that this was happening even before the independence of Zimbabwe. But a lot of people would have thought that with President Mnangagwa coming in, things would have changed, but it just seems to be a repetition of what has happened for so many decades.
Yeah, well, look, let me make it clear. I'm not an authority on Zimbabwe, on Zimbabwean politics or economics. I'm the publisher I published this report to assist the people who put it together. But, at face value, certainly, although the president may say that he wants to stop illicit financial transfers, that he's against corruption, it doesn't appear to be happening. Zimbabwe there's nobody prominent who is in prison at the moment for massive movements of money or goods out of the country. So it's not happening. You also have to remember that what happened in 2017 was a coup to remove Robert Mugabe, who had become too costly to the regime. But underlying the coup was the desire to protect the regime, not to protect the ordinary person in Zimbabwe. And that is why, despite the initial promises that we heard of a new dawn of freedom and openness and democracy and accountability, the people of Zimbabwe have not had that in their day-to-day experience and continue to face not only shortages, but authoritarian behavior by the police and by the government.
I'll be continuing my conversation with Mr. Mark Heywood, the editor of the Daily Maverick, with regards to the report, the 64-page report of the study of cartel dynamics that is happening right next door to us in Zimbabwe. Stay tuned. Welcome to Truth to Power. I'm continuing my conversation with Mr. Mark Heywood, the editor of the Daily Maverick, with regards to the discussion of the study of cartel dynamics. Now, Mr. Heywood, Adam Molai, now of course a representative of the cigarette conglomerate Pacific Cigarette Company, has called the report, and I quote, vindictive and lacks foundation. Do you think this is somebody who's on the defensive with regards to the report that was published last week?
Look, I don't think that the report is vindictive against anybody, and I certainly don't think that it lacks foundation. As I keep pointing out, this report, in many ways, it more resembles an academic report than a newspaper sensational report. It has 462 different references to the allegations that it makes. The vast part of the report is actually made up of through a literature review of reports over the years, and it just joins the dots to show what actually is happening. I also don't think that it's inappropriate to respond in that way and call it vindictive and without foundation when everybody, including Mr. Molai, knows that corruption is a huge problem in Zimbabwe. So if Mr. Molai has criticisms of the report to make, then, and has an alternative narrative or an alternative explanation for what is going on, including in his industry, which is the tobacco industry, then he would be of more assistance to this matter if he were to make his critique a matter for public debate rather than attacking the report and its authors.
Mr. Heywood, we look at Zimbabwe, and of course, you know, I've never been to Zimbabwe, but I don't know whether you have. But when you listen to the stories that Hopewell Chinono, when he's allowed to do it, and Ms. Fadzai Mahere, when you look at Zimbabwe, it's of course you've got the class that has the money, and then you've got the class that is sitting absolutely poor right now. A GDP which continues to be hit hard because unemployment and a health crisis that is taken to a whole new level. And then you, of course, have the gold and the diamonds and all sorts of resources being taken out of the country and the illicit financing that is happening with regards to it. How does the situation get solved? Because it just seems that these key players, or these players who want to really just take this money out and not worry about the citizens, keep getting away from it. How does the stamping down of this occur?
Well, in this respect, I think South Africa has a very important role to play. And it's not just South Africa having a role to play in terms of telling Zimbabwe what to do. It's the role that we can play in our own territory in making this type of corruption impossible. The gold that gets smuggled out of Zimbabwe gets smuggled to South Africa. before it gets smuggled onwards to places like Dubai. The cigarettes that get smuggled out of Zimbabwe get sold in South Africa by corrupt tobacco networks that are operating in South Africa. The diamonds that get smuggled out come not only through South Africa, but also through South Africa. And I believe that our authorities know who the individuals are involved. I hate to say this, but I believe that some of our police and political leaders are probably bought by some of the Zimbabwean cartel bosses. So if we cleaned our own house up, we would be doing an enormous favor to the people of Zimbabwe in their domestic struggle against corruption. And I would also say that, you know, we have an unfortunate record for the last 25 years of not at a political level, at a governmental level, from Thabo Mbeki through to Kgalema Motlanthe and now through to President Ramaphosa, of covering up and trying to play down the scale of the crisis in Zimbabwe. I think we need to speak openly. It's a crisis of democracy, it's a crisis of corruption, it's a crisis of economy. And by not speaking openly, the people who pay the price are the people of Zimbabwe. And we also know as South Africans, I mean, you say you haven't been to Zimbabwe, but we also know that there are millions of Zimbabweans who live and try to work in South Africa because that country, that rich country, can't offer employment to people. So if we approach the Zimbabwean issue in a better manner, it might also alleviate the migration crisis that we experience in this country as people flee from a country where otherwise they would starve.
But and that's the next question I want you to bring in. I mean, we see, of course, the migrants that are coming through to Zimbabwe. And of course, whenever there's a xenophobic crisis that does happen in South Africa, I mean, they are one of the groups that, of course, pay the price. And of course, all they want to do is come to South Africa and look for a chance of living, because they're not allowed that in their country. And when you speak to people who are, of course, Zimbabwean nationals that are here in South Africa, obviously when the coup did happen in 2017, and I know you're not an expert in terms of the larger politics of Zimbabwe, but a lot of people said that when President Emmerson Mnangagwa came in, it was a case of a lesser of two evils. Now, some people would say that, well, of course, the short-term fix would be get President Mnangagwa out, bring somebody new. But if these cartels are still operating, we're still going to have a repetition of things, aren't we?
Of course, and that's why there was no rupture, as I said. 2017 wasn't a rupture. 2017 was meant to allow things to continue as they were. And they have continued as they are. That's the problem. And so what we really need in Zimbabwe is genuine participatory democracy. Zimbabwe has a constitution that it adopted in 2013 that is almost as progressive as South Africa's constitution. Zimbabwe needs to live by its constitution. You know, Zimbabwe has an opposition. It's still a multi-party democracy, even though ZANU-PF behaves as if it's a one-party state. And there are very competent people who are members of the opposition in Zimbabwe. So that's what we really need, is we need a constitutional state, and we need a dialogue within Zimbabwe, between Zimbabweans, to chart a path to prosperity and freedom in that country.
Mr. Haywood, I want to turn the attention to media freedom and, of course, activism freedom. And, of course, we don't have with us Hopewell Chinono and Fadzai Mahere just to give us an idea of it. But I know that you interact with them a lot. And here in South Africa, I mean, even though you have, attacks from certain political parties on media, whether it be, an article being written wrong or whatever the case may be, it doesn't lead to journalists or editors being, facing prison time, which of course is happening in Zimbabwe. If this suppression continues, how bad does it erode the democracy and the constitution of Zimbabwe for a country that, if this does happen, we could be moving more and more into some sort of an authoritarian state, and they just right next door to us?
Well, we're not moving more and more into an authoritarian state. It is an authoritarian state. People live in a lot of fear. There's a young student leader. I hope I remember his name correctly. I think it's Adam Moyo, maybe David Moyo, who's now 71 days in prison. He's still in prison, just with allegations that he was involved in organizing protests. That's what's going on in that country. So yes, of course, things can always get worse in a authoritarian dictatorship, in a kleptocracy. But they've reached a bad state in that country already, which again is why you see these manifestations of popular discontent, such as that which has been catalyzed by, Hopewell's little video, Dem Loot, that has gone viral around the country. People aren't allowed to protest on the streets anymore, but they find other ways of showing their discontent. If you remember, last year there was an attempt to hold a protest against the hunger and the shortages, and nobody dared to come out. And the very few people who did come out, including Tsitsi Dangaremba, the world-respected novelist, found themselves arrested. So even if you were walking 2 or 3 people on the street holding up a banner, then you were bundled into the back of a police van and found yourself in prison for a few days or for a few weeks. That's a very problematic situation. And of course, it chills media freedom, which brings us back to where we started, which is, ideally the people who wrote this report would have wanted to have put their names to it, answer for it, and have it published in their own country, but they couldn't do that.
Mr. Haywood, just to wrap things up, you spoke about the potential, the actual corruption that is happening with regards to our borders here in South Africa, when, of course, the gold and the diamonds and the tobacco is being transferred, the potential of certain, law enforcement authorities being bribed in order to let this go. And, we have a president in Zimbabwe, in Emmerson Mnangagwa, being one of those cartel bosses. The AU and SADC have come under tremendous criticism for, not acting hard, of course, on countries that have seen coups happening or dictatorships or presidents being outside of their terms of the constitution. What does the AU and SADC, and especially President Cyril Ramaphosa, need to do now to make sure, and we're not talking of, sending an army through to Zimbabwe or sanctions, but just to get President Mnangagwa to stamp on these cartel bosses and make sure that the citizens of Zimbabwe can reap the riches of the country?
Yeah, very good question. So all I would say is that AU has a responsibility. It should, to begin with, frown on what is happening in Zimbabwe, to put it mildly. SADC too has a responsibility. What I would say is that, 5 or 6 years ago, President Mugabe was instrumental, with the support of South Africa, in having the SADC tribunal dismantled and disbanded and broken up. The SADC tribunal was a regional human rights court for the Southern Africa, for all the members of SADC. There is still no SADC tribunal, so there is still no means of recourse for people in countries where their governments refuse the rule of law and refuse to respect human rights. So again, South Africa, together with the African Union, together with SADC, could play a very important role in putting that body back together again. There are regional human rights bodies in East Africa, in West Africa, certainly in East and West Africa. There isn't one in Southern Africa, and that's a very dangerous omission.
Mark Haywood, the editor of the Daily Maverick. Thank you so much for shedding light with regards to the 64-page report. We will definitely have you again on the show, and hopefully we'll be able to get Hopewell Chinono and Fadzai Mahere just to give their experiences of what is happening in Zimbabwe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
No, it is an absolute pleasure. Well, we just heard it there from Mr. Mark Haywood. Of course, what is going on in Zimbabwe? At the end of the day, it is the citizens of the country that will continue to suffer. Remember, Zimbabwe has been labeled as the breadbasket of Africa. But if corruption continues to happen, if suppression of media and activism continues to occur in that country, then how is Zimbabwe going to function as a democracy? The role, of course, is for the African Union and SADC to go ahead and sit down with President Emmerson Mnangagwa and just find an amicable solution to this problem. Cartel bosses exist there. State capture, of course, is not just here in South Africa, but is happening in Zimbabwe. And as long as that is occurring, the citizens will continue to suffer at most. Well, this is all we have for you here on Truth to Power. I will see you again, same time, same place next week. Do enjoy the rest of your week and your weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.